Okay, hello everybody. It's the 20th of September 2021, and I would like to introduce our speaker. John Bray, our speaker, first visited Ladakh in 1979 and has retained a close connection with the region ever since. He is a former president of the International Association for Ladakh Studies and has published extensively on Ladakh history, with a specialist interest in Western missionary contacts and trading relations, something we've heard quite a bit about from former speakers in Japan. He lived in Japan, and I believe in Tokyo, from 2002 to 2015, and he's now based in Singapore. Okay, well, it's time to pull on your woolen shawls and sheepskin coats and enjoy. I present John Bray and Ladakh, a global perspective on a Himalayan kingdom. Okay, John, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you from me, I'm sure, from all of us for the nurturing. That's a good word. So my title is a global perspective. What I'm actually going to give you is a kind of historical anthology sharing things I'm interested in from the history of Ladakh since the 17th century or so. And to the extent that there's a common theme, I am saying global perspective. It's a local perspective, but there is perhaps a common theme. If you Google Ladakh, you get a lot of tourist propaganda about Ladakh as a kind of hidden kingdom. It's a Shangri-La. Well, it is a beautiful place. It's a remote place. It has its appeal, but it's actually not that remote. It's part of our world, and it always has been part of our world. There are, of course, extensive links with other parts of Asia, and maybe there are even some parallels with Japan. So here's my menu. Patricia was saying, get your boots on. It's going to be quite a brisk walk, so you will need your boots on. I'm going to tell you or remind you where Ladakh is, and then take you to the royal court, the 17th century royal court, and take you from there through the view from the monastery, sources of wealth, politics, and recent times. So first of all, to remind you where we're talking about, here's a relief picture. The red circle reminds you it's in the Western Himalaya. It's actually between the Himalaya and the Karakoram. Within that red circle, you can perhaps see a line pointing northwest. That's the Indus Valley. It's also the area where the tectonic plates, it's where India meets Asia, and the two tectonic plates are still colliding, still pushing the Himalayas slightly higher every year. So how you get there, Michael was just saying he nearly went there in the same year that I did in 1979. So I was, I guess, a bit luckier. If you're coming from Kashmir, you would see the picture, the kind of place on the left. This is Sonamarg. It's quite green in May or June. It's a bit like Switzerland, maybe different kinds of trees, but roughly the same sort of trees. And then you would go up the Soji Pass. It is a bit like going from black and white. That actually is a black and white picture from 1928. That's a good path, repaired by the British administration. Before then, it would have been the same kind of path on a cliff face, but much narrower and even more scary. And at the top of the pass, you might see a landscape like this. In fact, this is what I saw pretty well. This is a picture from May 1931, but it's pretty well what I saw in May 1979. The pass was almost open. I got a lift to the top in a truck, but then I had to walk over it and get a lift on the other side. And walking over, you'd see a landscape much like this. Very few trees. In fact, in this image, no trees. There are occasional oases. So it's basically a high altitude desert. If you're going now, you can still go from Kashmir. Oh, sorry, and that's the path from Kashmir. If, on the other hand, you were going from the north, from Xinjiang, or from what used to be often called Chinese Turkestan, you might travel with the help of one of these camels, two-humped Bactrian camels. These people, I think, that are on their way to Ladakh, but they're still on the northern side of the mountains. It's still quite flat, but the camels are famous for being sure-footed, going over mountain paths. Nowadays, this might be the kind of view that you would see. This is looking west, and coming into land, you would look up the Indus Valley, and you can see the Indus, and you can see there is indeed some green, and on the sides of the valley, not visible here, but there are villages which are irrigated by mountain streams. The streams come from glacial melt. So in the summer, if you're a farmer and you want water, you don't pray for clouds and rain, you pray for sun to melt the glaciers. Not too fast, we hope. So that's the basic geography. And now to history, to the royal court. Let me first introduce you to what you see on arrival. This is the image that you would see. This image was taken in 1909, but in fact, had you had a photograph in 1809 or 1709, it would have looked pretty well the same. On the top right, you can see a palace built in the 1630s. It's the Palace of the King. The houses are round. The houses closer to the palace, on the bottom, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but on the left of the palace, there is Lompo House. Lompo is Prime Minister. The house is still there. It's the house of the Prime Minister. On the right, immediately below, there's a monastery, but I think this house is Munshi House. We'll hear some more about that. Munshi is an Urdu or Persian word, basically meaning a writer or sometimes a translator. It's a hereditary position. And lower down, these are all houses of leading families, many of whom likewise had hereditary positions within the royal court. That's an architectural picture. Just briefly, let's go on a detour to Japan. Thinking about the architectural significance, it reminded me a bit of this picture of the king and the king and the queen, or the emperor and the empress, and then senior and progressively more junior people underneath. Switching back from Japan to Ladakh, here is the king who built the palace or had the palace built. Notice this picture. I'll explain the context of the picture a little bit later. He's carrying a wheel as a symbol of his role as a Dharma king, a protector of the Buddhist Dharma. Admire the fabrics of the clothes he's wearing. It's, of course, a sign of status to have those kinds of fabrics. We actually have a description of him from an early traveler from 1631, who, here is a parallel with Japan. The traveler was a Jesuit, a Portuguese Jesuit, not the first that we know of, but the second. And oddly enough, both of the first, who was a Portuguese traveler in 1700, and then this Portuguese Jesuit, they described the kings, different kings, in more or less the same terms. They said they both looked like Javanese. I guess that makes sense, because if you're Portuguese traveling via Goa, you might have met Javanese. It's a kind of point of comparison. The Ladakhis, Tibetans, kinds of people you might meet, they don't look like Indians, okay, maybe a Southeast Asian. His description wasn't especially flattering. He noticed that the king had earrings. He described his wife, who apparently was rather bossy. He said he was wearing rather shabby clothes. What he also said, and again, this is important for what goes on later, he said that as a mark of honor, the king and the queen, they presented them with tea, and the Jesuit, his name was Azevedo, writing for his superiors, he drew a link with Japan, explicitly Japan and China, known to these Jesuits from that period. He said they drink tea there too, but in Ladakh, they drink tea with butter and a little bit of salt. That sounds very, very familiar. Here, continuing with the images of the Ladakhi court, here's another image, again, a bit like the Japanese one. On the left, you have the king. On the right, a religious leader. And again, I'll show you a close-up. They are drinking, you can see the jugs, probably drinking tea, possibly drinking beer, but I think more likely tea, especially if monks are involved. Admire the king's headgear. It's a turban, and I'm pointing that out. You're going to see a variety of hats. People have written, I know one person in particular who has written a whole book about hats from Tibet. They change over time. They change according to the status of who you are. This is a hat of high rank. Partly, again, in relation to my global theme, this kind of turban we now associate with South Asia, but in this period and earlier, it was also associated with West Asia. We have pictures of the Emperor of Constantinople wearing similar, rather dramatic turbans. Emperor, I'm referring to the Christian Byzantine emperor. Further image, here we have the court musicians. I'm guessing, and it's an informed guess, that these court musicians are Muslims. What is behind the guess? Well, we know that the king we were talking about, Sengi Namgyal, his mother was a Muslim from the neighboring state of Baltistan. She introduced court musicians. Again, there was a kind of hereditary status of court musicians. And the style of music still today in Ladakh, it's like many things, it's a kind of hybrid. The instrumental music apparently tends more to West Asia, whereas many of these songs are more like Tibetan. So here you can see them banging these double-sided drums. Perhaps can't see very well, but the fellow in the middle is playing what looks like a kind of oboe. Continuing with the local geography, here's a small mosque recently restored. It's at the bottom of the hill. It was granted, it's in a garden, Tsatsoma garden, granted according to the oral history, again by the same king, Sengi Namgyal, and originally for local traders, probably from Kashmir in the 1630s. The chronology of the images is jumping around a bit, but here is another image. This actual photograph, it's 1861. It's the earliest known photograph of Ladakh. But the buildings you can see are much older. This is the bazaar. And here is probably the original Jama Masjid, the Great Mosque, built in 1661. And there is a story behind it. This is probably the original building. The story behind it is that Ladakh was threatened with an invasion by the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb. Basically, they sued for peace. One of the conditions for peace was that they should build a mosque. Another was that the king would become a Muslim. So for diplomatic purposes, he pretended to become a Muslim with the name Akibat Mahmud Shah Mahmud Khan, and also that he should issue coins in the name of the Mughal emperor. Well, he took the title, he took the name, he built the mosque. He didn't become a Muslim. He was far enough away that nobody was going to check decisively. But there were some coins struck. Here is Aurangzeb, and here is a silver rupee. It carry in the name of the Mughal emperor, but struck in Tibet-kew-shoo. Tibet-kew-shoo is not Tibetan, not Ladakhi, actually not Urdu, it's Persian. And it's the name by which Tibet was known in Persian sources. It means Great Tibet. Baltistan next door was Little Tibet. So that's my quick tour of the royal court. And now here's a view from the monastery. Oh, and yeah, actually, well, I still have, I had a cutout from the picture from 1861. I forgot to point out, but here he is in the cutout. There's a miniature picture of an Englishman with his umbrella, a companion of the person who took the picture. So turning to the view from the monastery, here on the left is probably one of the most famous monasteries of Ladakh, which is Hemis Monastery. Not the most spectacular monastery, but one of the most famous. It was refounded under Sendi Namgyal, I guess 1620s or 1630s. On the right is the person who, under royal patronage, was the Buddhist leader, the Lama, we can almost say the patriarch who refounded it. His title is Tagtsang Repa. Tagtsang means tiger nest. There's a monastery in Bhutan with the same name. He, in fact, was from central Tibet. He traveled quite widely. He is known to have traveled to Udyana, which seems to be an old name for what is now the Pakistani region of Swat, which was formerly a Buddhist center. I'm not sure what he would have found in the 17th century, but it would have been, nonetheless, it was regarded as a kind of holy land from a Buddhist perspective. Here again, he's wearing a distinctive hat. I, in my imagination, I think it looks a little bit like what in Pakistan they would say a chitrali topi, or like the hats which Afghans still wear. I can't say for certain about that. And then I suggested you remember the picture of Sengi Namgyal. I said it was a particular context. Well, the bottom left is where that picture comes from. So this is a monastic view of status. Tagtsang Repa is by far the most important person from a status point of view. He is the Lama, he's a sacred Lama. The king is important, but his importance is as a patron of the monastery, giving it financial support. What that means, of course, status depends on your point of view, but the king, in fact, would have been a good Buddhist. He wouldn't have denied, I guess, his relative status. But it's a reciprocal status. It's mutual support. The king as patron giving financial support and protection, the Lama giving his blessing, giving status and legitimacy. The The other things I wanted to point out, the Lama he's wearing, it's a white cloth. He is supposed to have worn quite simple cotton, probably actually in Ladakh, woolen dress, although this seems like, again, it seems to have a kind of brocade. But on the table in front of him, there's another thing I want to point out, and I'll explain why I'm pointing it out later. You can maybe just see it. It looks to me like a bell, and the bell has a special handle. If you know Buddhist symbols in Sanskrit, it's a vajra, a symbol of a thunderbolt. In Tibetan dorji, it's a kind of ritual implement, and we'll see that again later, so just remember it, and I'll say more about it later. Here, this is again as a reminder of not just local but regional connections. This is Ngawang Gyaltsen. He's a well-known Lama from Bhutan. He's also something of a traveler. Earlier in his life, he had been to Eastern Tibet in Kham. In the, I think between 1708 and 1712, maybe a bit later, he spent several years as a guest of the king of Ladakh. And this image is more or less life-size, probably a bit smaller than life-size. It's in Stakna Monastery, which is famous, I mean, it's well known for its links. It belongs to the same Buddhist school as the leading school, it's the Drukpa school of Bhutan. His hat, again, admire his hat. That's a kind of Drukpa style, particularly a big one though, again, as a sign of his status. So not only monks traveling, several months walk, but mountains are no obstacle to determined travelers, but also books travel. And here, courtesy of my friend and colleague, Georgios Halkias, this is a Buddhist text, the Sanskrit name below. This is in the Tibetan script. So the first thing to do is to invite you to admire the script. It's an Indian script. It works in the same way as Devanagari, the script used for Hindi and Sanskrit. It's different, but it works in the same way. If you know one, you can recognize letters from the other, the vowel sounds above and below. It works in that way. Admire the materials. It's got gold lettering. That gold may actually be drawing on gold pigment. The colors are basically natural dyes. And a couple of other things to note. The shape of the pages. Basically, this is a traditional shape founded on or an imitation of palm paper made or pages made from palm leaves, which historically would have been bound together with a bit of string in the middle. Tibetan books were loose leaf. I don't know if you can see my cursor. They were loose leaf. They weren't bound together with string, but for years they kept a kind of symbolic whole. So if you can see my cursor, there's a circle here to the right, diagonally right of the hand, and that's a symbolic space for where the string would have been, but now wasn't. So yeah, books made locally, books like this is handwritten, also printed using wooden blocks. Books traveled, very valuable status symbols, symbols of learning. So now to support monasteries, you needed money. Where did the money come from? Well, it came from the king. It came from rich families. But where did they get their money from? I've shown you the images of Ladakh. It's a high altitude desert, you can grow barley, but it's quite difficult to get rich on barley. So where did the money come from? Well, in fact, some of it may have come from literally gold. To Western Tibet, which until the 17th century were controlled by Ladakh, did have gold, alluvial gold, but also near surface gold diggings. But also these creatures on the bottom left are my clue for the major sources of wealth. It's wool, and specifically it's pashmina wool, which comes from the lower belly of the goat, which was used to make pashmina shawls. So here's again a picture. This is an image from late 19th century, but it could have been, again, if we had photographs or drawings from almost any time in the previous 2 centuries until the mid 20th century. These are a mixture of goats and sheep. They're coming from the highlands of Ladakh and neighboring Tibet. They are carrying their own wool, quite thin. They're carrying the wool that they themselves are wearing. They're also carrying saddlebags. Those bags might contain more wool, but they were also containing salt. And they're on their way to one of several annual fairs along the slopes of the Himalaya. So that's one source of wealth. And here is a sample. It's a cashmere shawl from the 18th century. This particular one from Varanasi, a museum. Of course, the designs of shawls developed and got more sophisticated over a time. Some points to be made about the wealth of shawls, who made the most money out of the shawls. It wouldn't have been the producers of the wool. It wouldn't have been the nomads who looked after the sheep. They would have got some money, but not a lot. It would have been partly the king of Ladakh, because the king was the trader in chief. It would have been the merchants who supported the king. They were working for the king, but also working for themselves. But the real value added, to use an economic term, would have been more at the Kashmir end, at all ends, but the king and at the Kashmir end. Another long distance trade item is this. So it's tea. It's brick tea. It's the kind of tea that even now, or at least until recently, people have used in Ladakh and Tibet. Brick tea pressed together. From a Chinese point of view, it's regarded as low-grade tea, but it's the kind of tea that they were used to. They would make tea, as I say, with butter and salt. That's not the kind of tea we're used to. If you think of it as soup, that maybe gives you a better idea. Because it came from a long distance, at least until recently, it was a high value item, which is also why it was a status item. So to say something about that distance, where did it come from? It came from Sichuan and Yunnan on the right-hand side. And the first stage of the journey is that it was carried on the backs of people. These are porters from Yunnan, Sichuan. Their loads, they're on their way to, the Tibetan name is Datsedo, the contemporary Chinese name is Kanding in Western Sichuan. It's a kind of border town, was a border town. Tibetan speaking ruled by a Tibetan king, but under Chinese overlordship. And these loads would be, I'm not sure how much, but I think at least 100 weight, something like that. That said, it would be wrapped up in a kind of leather parcel and loaded onto yaks and going north and west to Lhasa. Here it is in Lhasa. They look at the size of suitcases, but these are basically leather hides sewn together, each containing these blocks of bricks. I think in the shelf in the background, you can see some of these bricks. And then carried further west. So this is a picture taken by Sven Hayden. It's Western Tibet. This is a particular trader. We know him, we know who he is. His name is Ghulam Rasul. He's likewise wearing a fine turban. He's wearing a Ladakhi goncha. And he's a member of one of these leading Muslim trading families who were court traders. They first came, his ancestor is thought to have come to Ladakh in the mid-17th century as a writer and speaker of Persian, because that was the diplomatic language. They intermarried with Ladakhis. They, in fact, also intermarried with Tibetans. They had networks, family networks in Lhasa, actually in West Bengal, in Kalimpong and Darjeeling, and also on the northern side from Ladakh in Xinjiang, Turkestan. So how do you pay for the tea? Well, I showed you the earlier, the silver rupee, but that was probably not many of those in circulation. Probably it was more of a kind of symbolic special issue. These are the coins that were used in the 19th century to pay for tea at for wool, maybe for tea as well. And rather roughly struck, again, probably by a Muslim silversmith. A couple of things to notice. The Persian script, it says Mahmud Shah. Again, that could be a kind of pun. It could be the name of a ruler of Kashmir, or it could be the echo of the king's name, Mahmud Akibat Shah. And then the bottom one, this is jumping ahead a little bit, but that's in Devanagari script. You might just about be able to read it. It's the name of the first Gulab Singh, the first Maharaja of Jammu Kashmir. So silver jao. What does jao mean? Ja is tea, and the blocks of tea that I showed you, they were used as a form of currency. They were also used as a form of diplomatic present. And the idea would be that these small coins, the size of the coin, it's about the size of a, what am I thinking of, 50 yen, the old 50 yen. I think I've seen such things, half the size of 100 yen. Yeah, they were used to as a form of currency in Ladakh and Western Tibet. Where did the silver for that come from? Well, here's the answer. It came from China as ingots carried over the Karakoram Pass to Ladakh and then melted down. And the source of silver in China at this point, there were silver mines, I believe, in Yunnan, but more of the silver came from Mexico. Already in the 17th century, certainly in the 19th century, most of China's silver came from Mexico. Just to remind you, Patricia's talk was partly about that. It was about the Mexican link with the Philippines and with Japan and across the Pacific again to Mexico. So local trade, but already at that time, global connections. So hoping you're not completely out of breath in your boots and your shawl, I started with court status. I've given you some economics and trade, and now some politics. So historically, Ladakh was an independent kingdom, Buddhist kingdom, but with links, Muslim links. I mentioned the Muslim traders. I should also say in Western Ladakh, a large part of the local village population were also Muslims already from, let's say, the 16th century. So Ladakh was looking in several directions. It was always looking east to Tibet. It was looking west to Kashmir, south to Indian plains, and north to Turkestan. And politically, to some extent, it was making friends with everybody, playing off everybody, occasionally fighting wars with different people. From the 1640s, 1650s, central Tibet, the Dalai Lama, the fifth Dalai Lama, was growing in political power. Here's the Potala, built over several years, but in the 1650s, after the Leh Palace, the Ladakhis say their palace is smaller, but it's in a somewhat similar style. They had their palace first. But admire the Potala. It's a symbol, it's a very physical symbol of political status as well as religious status. The two go together. Dalai Lama, Buddhist incarnation, supported by armies, supported by Mongol armies specifically.
Mm-hmm.
In the sorry, okay. Could you go on mute? So in the 1640s, 1650s, the Dalai Lama, he was by no means a Gandhian pacifist. On the contrary, as part of his mission of projecting power, a friend of mine has described it as part of a salvation project. He was exerting political power, including military power, to the east in Kham, a series of wars. Actually, that arrow, no, the arrow is on course, should be slightly to the left, a series of wars with Bhutan, and also between 1679 and 1684, a war led by a Mongol general, a former monk turned Mongol general with Ladakh. The outcome of that war was a treaty of Temesgang. Temesgang is a place. Here is the place in the middle. This is it's a Ladakhi oasis, but here's quite a big monastery. And the outcome, the points of the treaty were, first, Ladakh lost a lot of territory in Western Tibet. The boundary with Western Tibet has been roughly what it still is, but it wasn't demarcated. That's something which will come to haunt us in recent times, just in one place, specifically a place called Demtrok. It said there's a particular stream which is the boundary. So the boundary changed. There was an arrangement whereby Ladakh would send a series of presents to Lhasa every 3 years. It's not specified in the treaty, but Lhasa sent reciprocal presents. And the economic arrangements that I was alluding to earlier were also set in the treaty. So what it says is that Kashmiri traders working for the king of Ladakh basically had a monopoly on the most valuable Pashmina wool. And another set of traders would have monopoly on the link between Ladakh and Kashmir. So my argument, I'm slightly disputing what this famous Italian historian was saying. He was basically saying this treaty marks the end of Ladakh as a regional power. I'm saying that it was a considerable setback but actually both sides kept what was really important from a economic point of view. And it was a relationship which basically kept the peace between Ladakh and Tibet for the next nearly 200 years, not quite 200 years. So here are the symbols of the Ladakhi presence to Kashmir. Specified in the treaty, it was a cloth. The word for the cloth is a little bit hard to interpret, but it probably means, it came to mean Ladakhi, Kashmiri shawls. There was some gold. And what you see in the middle is saffron. Saffron was grown in Kashmir. It was a kind of high value trading item, which was for the Tibetans a symbol of good things which came from the West. In return, Tibetans sent tea as presents to Ladakh, tea in particular, in fact. Ladakh also sent presents to Kashmir. It was specified on the left, on the top, you see yak tails. Also in Mughal texts, we have references to yak tails, oddly enough, decorating the ears of elephants. They seem to have had some kind of importance as a status symbol for Mughal emperors, Mughal governors of Kashmir. Ladakh also sent an annual present of, I don't know why, but piebald horses, 18, count them. And in the middle, it's less obvious, but this is a musk deer and another high value trade item, musk pods. They're a gland from the deer, which is used to make musk perfume, which, as I say, was a high value trade item across, also in West Asia. So basically in the 18th century, from 1684, Ladakh was at peace, at least with Tibet, scattered minor wars with Baltistan. Then in 1634, the character who's on the right, who's Gulab Singh, he was a Raja of Jammu, a general in his service, invaded and conquered Ladakh. In 1841, he tried to invade Tibet. He was defeated by the Tibetans, or more accurately, he was defeated because he was defeated by the winter. From 1842, Jammu was recognized as controlling Ladakh, and in